Hey there. Today I'm going to continue talking to you about metabolism, and before I get started, I want to tell you what the second thing was that I was most excited about. My guess is that you probably watched the last video. The first thing was that I'm feeling a lot better about metabolism, and the second thing is that I have this headset that my husband gave me that feels so much better on my ears than the Apple headphones that I was wearing, and I am pretty excited about that. So completely irrelevant, not having anything to do with chemistry, but I'm really happy about it. So metabolism talks about the chemical reactions that occur in our bodies, and it is so very, very complex. So in this video, I'm going to start simple, and we're going to look at an overview of what happens when we consume fats and carbohydrates and proteins and how we can get energy from them. And then we're going to look in particular at the citric acid cycle and this electron transport chain. So these two last stages of food, what happens to food when we eat it. And we're going to remain pretty broad. So first kind of broad and then detailed with this, and then in a later series of videos, we will talk in more detail about carbohydrates in this process, about lipids in this process, and about proteins in this process. And initially, we're just going to start talking about the catabolism of the food that we eat. And again, catabolism is the breakdown of large molecules to make them into smaller molecules and to ultimately get energy from them. When we talk in more detail about lipids and carbohydrates and proteins, we will look at how those molecules will be used to build some things to go through anabolic processes. So in the first stage, we have digestion. We eat fats, we eat carbohydrates, we eat proteins. When we eat fats in digestion, it gets broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. When we eat carbohydrates, it breaks down into glucose and some other sugars. And we probably won't mention them because glucose is fundamentally the body's most preferred fuel. And when proteins become digested, they break down into amino acids. So once we have broken down our macromolecules into smaller bits, it can go through the second stage of catabolism of foods, or the breakdown of foods with energy being produced as a major outcome. Now, the second stage is the production of this thing right here, acetyl-CoA. I realize there's an S there. It's on this slide, but in all of the other resources that I see it is typically not included. The reason that S is there is because there is a sulfur atom, and some people like to really reinforce the fact that we have an acetyl group, which happens to have two carbons attached to this coenzyme, which is pretty big, and there's a sulfur atom involved. So anyway, stage one, digestion. We're breaking our lipids down and our carbohydrates down and our proteins into smaller bits. The fatty acids will undergo oxidation, and they will get turned directly into acetyl-CoA. The amino acids can also get turned directly into acetyl-CoA, and they can follow some other pathways. The glucose undergoes a process called glycolysis, and glycolysis turns glucose into something called pyruvate, which ultimately turns into acetyl-CoA. Now, acetyl-CoA is what is absolutely necessary to start this next stage 3, the citric acid cycle. And what happens in the citric acid cycle is this acetyl group breaks apart from the CoA, and there are 2 carbons, and remember that these carbons originally came from either fats or sugars or proteins, but we have these carbons. They're referred to as reduced carbons, and they start undergoing this citric acid cycle. And essentially they go through a series of steps, and there are three major outcomes. One is the production of carbon dioxide. It does require oxygen to take place. Another is the production of some ATP, not very much, only 2 ATPs per 2 units of carbon. Actually, it's 2 ATPs per glucose molecule. So it's going to be a different count if we're looking at fats or proteins. And then the most important product of stage 3 is this right here, reduced coenzymes. Now, these are a key player in what makes things happen. They are referred to as NADH and FADH2. They are reduced in that they have a couple extra hydrogens, and they also have gained electrons. And these reduced coenzymes trigger stage 4. And this is where we get the most bang for our buck. The reduced enzymes become oxidized, and they lose some of their electrons. Oxidation is loss, and these electrons bounce down this electron transport chain. It requires energy, or it requires oxygen, and these electrons bounce down this electron transport chain and ultimately produce ATP. Now, I've kept it very simplified there. Now, I've made another drawing of this as well, so I just would like to very briefly summarize it again. I have it color-coded. My stage 1 is digestion, proteins getting broken down into amino acids, carbohydrates into glucose, and fatty acids into fats into fatty acids and glycerol. Stage 2 is the production of this acetyl-CoA. Without acetyl-CoA, we cannot have the citric acid cycle. Without the citric acid cycle, we cannot get our reduced coenzymes. And without our reduced coenzymes, we cannot get a series of chemical reactions that produce the ATP in the electron transport chain. So a key thing here is that proteins, carbohydrates, and fats can all result in acetyl coenzyme A. So they all lead to the production of these, this acetyl group, which has 2 carbons, and it's attached to a very, very large enzyme. This acetyl coenzyme A starts going through a cycle where it is bouncing from one reaction to the next, and it gives off a little bit of energy. With glycolysis, with the glucose step, that also gives off a little bit of ATP. The citric acid cycle gives off a little bit of ATP. It gives off carbon dioxide. It requires oxygen. But the main thing here is the production of these reduced coenzymes. Again, they are referred to as NADH and FADH2. These reduced coenzymes will become oxidized. They're going to lose their electrons. And I'm keeping it very broad here. These electrons bounce from protein to protein in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So electrons bounce from protein to protein, and the movement of that electron causes something to happen that allows ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, to gain a phosphate group to form ATP. And that process is called oxidative phosphorylation. Again, we are going to talk more in depth about the citric acid cycle and more in depth about electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. And then after that, because it does not matter which pathway we take, whether it's proteins or carbohydrates or fats, each and every single one of them is going to involve the production of acetyl-CoA, the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain, and the oxidative phosphorylation that happens because of the electron transport chain. So these are like coupled reactions. The one allows the other to take place. So the citric acid cycle, it starts again, remember, with that acetyl coenzyme A, which is a two carbon unit. And it goes through a series of 8 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In that, it produces 2 carbon dioxides. It produces 4 reduced coenzymes. So remember, those reduced enzymes are the magical thing that gives us the electrons later to allow the ATP to be formed. It gives 4 reduced coenzymes, and it gives a 1 energy-rich phosphate group, which will ultimately turn to ATP. So it provides a little bit of energy. Now, the reason it's a cycle, because once you get to your final step, that allows you to start the cycle over again. It just gets recycled. So 8 steps results in the breakdown of acetyl groups into 2 molecules of carbon dioxide, and we get a little bit of energy. But the most energy really is the energy that is being carried by these reduced coenzymes. They are going to provide the energy needed to start the electron transport chain and the oxidative phosphorylation. One thing about the citric acid cycle is if with each step of the way, enzymes are required. So here is our acetyl group here. What happens is the 2 carbon acetyl group hooks up with a 4 carbon molecule to make a 6 carbon molecule. And this, each step of the way, things change. So here we go from a 6 carbon molecule to a 5 carbon molecule because we have 1 carbon dioxide being given off. Here we go from a 5 carbon molecule to a 4 carbon molecule because we have another carbon dioxide being given off. Between these 2 steps, we have a reduced coenzyme being produced. We have another here. This GTP is a precursor to ATP, so it will ultimately form ATP. We have 4 carbons now, and as we go through the sequence of changes, we get another reduced enzyme and another reduced enzyme, and this same 4 carbon will now hook up with another acetyl-CoA. So the main thing here is we got these high energy carriers and some carbon dioxide given off and a little bit of ATP. But it is the most important aspect of the citric acid cycle is the production of these reduced enzymes. So once these reduced enzymes get to the beginning of the electron transport chain, I'll just give a brief preview of what happens. It occurs in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So if the mitochondria was like this, we have these squiggly, so it's occurring right on that inner membrane there. And there are some proteins in there. These proteins, some of them are integral proteins. They span the entire membrane. Some of them are not. I don't remember off the top of my head how many there are. And then there is, I'll stick another protein there, and then there is a channel here. So these reduced enzymes will lose their electrons, and the electron will bounce from this protein to this protein to this protein to this protein to this protein. And what happens is this NADH becomes oxidized and it turns into NAD plus because it lost its electron. Now, every single time we bump from one protein to another, it releases a hydrogen ion into the inner membrane space. And what happens is we get a buildup of hydrogen ions here, and they start to go through back that way. This is ATP synthase. It is a channel protein that spans the entire inner membrane, and we get our electrons bouncing. They're pushing out hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions are building up, and they start to go through the membrane, and it's almost like a paddle wheel. They are providing energy to take ADP and turn it into ATP. So this all occurs in the inner membrane. I'm not going to ask you to repeat that. I just want to give you a visualization of what is going on with this thing that we call this electron transport chain. So at the inner membrane, where we have these hydrogens shooting across this channel, it is giving the energy to add a phosphate group to an adenosine diphosphate and turn it into adenosine triphosphate. Now this ATP will exit the cell, exit the mitochondria, and it will go to wherever it's needed in the body, within whatever cell that it's in. Eventually it will lose its phosphate, and the energy will be used to do something in the body, and we have ADP again. So if we look at the molecules, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The reason that it's able to form is because our reduced enzymes, which are high energy carriers, were able to make their way to the inner membrane of the mitochondria and lose their electrons to allow ATP to provide the energy for the ATP to form. So here we see 3 phosphates. That is adenosine triphosphate. Now, when the energy is obtained from this high energy molecule, it gets turned into adenosine diphosphate. So the energy is stored in particular within this oxygen phosphorus bond between each of the phosphate groups. We can also get the cleaving here to form an adenosine monophosphate. That's not really a focus of our discussion in metabolism. So there is a lot of energy in that bond that is released when that phosphate bond is broken. The enzymes that we're talking about are NAD plus and NADH. This is the reduced enzyme. It ends up losing its electrons. It ends up losing some hydrogen. And it becomes oxidized to this. This is what ends up at the start of the electron transport chain. It loses those electrons. The electrons bounce from protein to protein to protein, pumping hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space, which eventually make their way through a channel to produce ATP. And this is the other reduced enzyme here. These are our energy carriers. When they lose their electrons, it makes things happen. So this just kind of summarizes this up. When we, and this is specifically talking about glucose, essentially. When we take glucose, it turns into pyruvate and it gets us to acetyl-CoA. So right here is this step where we have our, oh, actually it's right here. We have our acetyl coenzyme A entering the Krebs cycle. This, again, is in particular has to do with carbohydrate catabolism, which we're going to look at in more depth later. Remember that proteins, fats, and carbs get us here to acetyl coenzyme A. We get our Krebs cycle. We get a little bit of energy coming from that. Most important part of this is that it produces these reduced enzymes. These reduced enzymes will, at the site of the inner membrane, provide electrons that transport from one protein to another and allow the production of 34 ATPs per glucose molecule. Again, I don't remember how much it is for fats and proteins, but it's a significant amount of ATP. So the most important aspects of energy production in our body are these two steps. The Krebs cycle, which is also it's called the TCA cycle, which is the tricarboxylic acid cycle, and it's also called the citric acid cycle. And I apologize if I use the two interchangeably. So this, in conjunction with electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation, is where we're getting our energy from mostly. This is just a little image of the inner membrane. And with this, the citric acid cycle would be occurring in here, which would be this part right here. And then at the membrane, there's in between the inner membrane and the outer membrane, there's this space. So this would be the outer membrane. We have our reduced enzyme coming in and losing its electrons. And this is the path of the electrons. Boop, boop, boop. I guess it's gone to 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, every time as those electrons move, they start to pump hydrogen into the inner membrane space. So electron moves, pumps the hydrogen out. Electrons move, pump the hydrogen out. Electrons move, pump the hydrogen out. This is our electron transport. And all of a sudden, we have a whole bunch of hydrogen building up on this side. And it ends up being more concentrated. So what happens is it starts coming through this ATP synthase channel, and it acts kind of like a windmill or a water wheel, a paddle wheel. It provides the energy with each electron to add a phosphate group to ADP to make ATP. So this is the oxidative phosphorylation, and that is the electron transport. The next topic we're going to talk about in particular is the nitty-gritty details of glucose catabolism. And I'm just going to very quickly review what we talked about here. I will use this drawing. We eat our food, we eat our proteins or carbohydrates and our fats. They get broken down into their little bits. They ultimately make acetyl-CoA, which allows the citric acid cycle to occur. The citric acid cycle involves these acetyl groups making their way around and giving off some carbon dioxide and giving off some ATP, but most importantly, producing these reduced coenzymes, which will ultimately lose their electrons. The electrons bounce from protein to protein, and each time they do that, they end up adding some hydrogen to the inner membrane matrix, which provides the energy as it makes its way back through that ATP synthase for oxidative phosphorylation, and we get our ATP. So, thanks for watching.